Halav Yisrael. This is the exciting topic of today's shiur. Exciting because for many people this is a very hot topic. What is Halav Yisrael? Do we keep Halav Yisrael? What do we need to know about Halav Yisrael? And perhaps I might start off somewhere a little different, and that is in a less traditional place. There was a famous Nazi propagandist, Yimach Shemo v'zicho, his name should be erased and blotted out, Joseph Goebbels. I think I'm saying his last name correctly. And if not, I don't care. And Joseph Goebbels said that he who wins the language wins the war. That in order to win a war, you don't really have to win the war. You don't have to be right. You just have to know how to present your idea in a way that the language makes you already victorious. I think about some things in politics that I might think of, and though I don't speak about politics ever, not in public and not in private, I don't involve myself, but as a rabbi who watches people debate my religion without any knowledge of it, you think in the realm of abortions, for abortions, against abortions, you hear these words. Nobody says, I'm for an abortion, I'm against abortions. They use words like pro-life or pro-choice. I mean, which kind of fool doesn't want to be pro-choice? You want to take away my choice? Or which kind of fool doesn't believe in life? You want to get rid of life? And so instead of dealing with the issue at hand, we create a word that you can't argue with anymore. And the same thing is true here with Halav Yisrael. The title of today's shiur is actually propaganda. And that is that we don't have this term of Halav Yisrael in traditional rabbinic literature. Halav Yisrael is a term that we use today, and I would say that as we read through the sources, I want you to be on the lookout. Does the term Halav Yisrael, until very much later in history, actually exist? And if it doesn't exist, so what exactly makes milk kasher or not kasher? And that brings me to today's shiur. We're on page 1, source 1. There are many sources I wish to go through with you today. And so, like Ohad mentioned, if there's a question that stops you from being able to comprehend what's going forward, please feel free to interrupt me. If you just need a clarification of a point or you want to ask something, I will stick around here later. I moved the shiur earlier so that I don't have to skimp on the Q&A element of the shiur, so I will be here for you at the end of the shiur as well. B'ezrat Hashem yitbarach. The Mishnah in Masechet Avodah Zarah. Now we've read this Mishnah a few times already, and every single time we've highlighted a different element of this Mishnah. Elu devarim shel goyim asurin, ve'en isuran isur hana'ah. These are the things of goyim that are forbidden to us, but they are not so forbidden that we cannot derive benefit from them. Chalav shechalavo goy, milk that was milked by a non-Jew, ve'en Yisrael ro'ehu, and a Jewish person does not see this non-Jew milking the cow. This milk is prohibited to us, but it is not so prohibited to us that we cannot, for example, sell it or feed it to our animals or whatever else would be considered an isur hana'ah. So here you find the first time in the Mishnah that we're referring to milk that is seemingly not kasher for a reason that has to do with non-Jews, and that is, a non-Jew milks a cow, we are forbidden from drinking it so long as a Jew has not seen him milking the cow. Let's look at the Gemara. And let's do it in English together. The Gemara asks concerning milk, with regard to what need we be concerned? Why is the milk prohibited? If it is due to the concern that a Gentile might exchange the milk of a kosher animal with the milk of a non-kosher animal, this concern is unfounded, as kosher milk is white, whereas non-kosher milk has a green tinge to it, and therefore they are easily distinguishable. And if it is prohibited due to the concern that it might be mixed with non-kosher milk, let the Jew curdle the milk obtained from the non-Jew, as the master said, Amar Mar, milk from a kasher animal curdles, the milk from a non-kasher animal does not curdle. So here Chachamim are trying to figure out, what exactly is the problem with chalav shechalavo goy, ve'en Yisrael ro'ehu? What is the problem with milk that a non-Jew milked and we didn't see him milking it? As if you think that the milk is not kasher, meaning they're switching it out for us with, give me a non-kasher animal milk, pig's milk, camel milk, I don't know what else. I mean, today all kinds of things make milk that are not animals. Like there's cashew milk and almond milk and all kinds of pea milk, but we're not referring to those milks. I mean, if you're talking milk from animals, those that nurse their young. So here you have the first answer, which is if we're concerned that they might switch the milk for us, we can distinguish kasher milk from non-kasher milk based on the whiteness or the greenness of this milk. And if you're concerned that maybe there is non-kasher milk mixed inside of the kasher milk, meaning you won't be able to tell them apart just by looking at them, so you should try to curdle it from making cheese. Why should you try to curdle it? Because our rabbis tell us that milk from a non-kasher animal does not curdle. But milk from a kasher animal curdles. So there's cow's milk, there's sheep's milk, there's cow's cheese, and there's goat cheese, and there's sheep cheese, but you don't have camel cheese or kangaroo cheese or whatever other cheese you might have, a pig cheese. And because of that, all you have to do to test the milk to make sure you can drink it is see if it curdles. If it curdles, you know the milk is kasher. If it doesn't curdle, you know it's not kasher. The Gemara answers, if one desires to eat it as cheese, indeed one can simply curdle it, as the milk of non-kasher animals do not curdle. What are we dealing with here? We are dealing with a case where one desires to use the milk as kamcha, also known as kutach, a food item that contains milk. So here, we are trying to make another dairy food, but it doesn't have the same rule as that food can be made also with non-kasher milk. And the Gemara mentions in the next section why this is not a reliable method to check if this milk is kasher. And that leads us to the discussion of whether this scientific reality that Chachamim mentioned to us, that milk curdles or doesn't curdle based on whether it's kasher milk or non-kasher milk. Now, oftentimes when Chachamim make a claim like that, we might be very quick to dismiss it. Like, okay, the rabbis were telling us something that we today know there's this kind of cheese and that kind of cheese, and it can't be that only kasher milk curdles. So I brought you here, in source 3, an essay that was written by a certain Aviad Beinenstock. I don't know who he is, but he quoted research from Bar Ilan University, and I could not find the original article, so I instead quoted his source of the original article. In Universitat Bar Ilan, so Bar Ilan University, together with the Laboratory for Milk Studies in Israel, they joined together to do research on this sentence of our rabbis. And they made 2 different ways to test milk. They're described in source 3, the bottom left of page 1. The first method they used is they took milk from kosher animals and non-kosher animals. And what they did was they added the enzyme rennet. Rennet is what they use to make cheese, the traditional method of using cheese, to see whether this milk would turn into cheese or not. And the second, they use something called an optigraph. Now, I'm not a food scientist nor any type of scientist, and this is able to check very quickly the strength of from what I understand, the strength of the curdle, meaning how well this milk has turned into cheese. The results on page 2 at the top right came out as follows: that milk from cows, goats, sheep, all kinds of kasher animals like deer and different antelope, different animals like that, all of those things, hamugdarim kebalei chaim torim, all of them turn into cheese. On the contrary, though, those that came from non-kasher animals, so such as a horse, an alpaca, a dog, a pig, and mother's milk, none of those milks were able to curdle and turn into cheese. And therefore you see that Chachamim were correct in their assumption, or their assertion, that milk that is kasher is able to be turned into cheese, and milk that is not kasher is not able to be turned into cheese. Now, could there be methods today in which people are turning something into a cheese-like substance? Absolutely. When Chachamim are talking, though, about cheese, they refer to this method of checking whether take rennet, add it to the milk, see if it turns into cheese. And if it does, you don't have to concern yourself anymore whether this milk is kasher or not, and then you would be able to consume this milk. In source 4, the Meiri suggests that perhaps the seller is mixing kasher milk and non-kasher milk in order to get some kind of advantage of the non-kasher milk is cheap, and he's adding it to the kasher milk to make sure he tricks you. It's like anything else. In the olden days in Ashkenaz, for example, they were concerned with buying sugar for Pesach. The reason they were concerned, because the merchants who sold the sugar was very expensive, flour was very cheap. When you mix white sugar with white flour all together, you can't really tell the difference between them. And they would sell the sugar by weight, and so they would trick you. You would think you're buying a cup of sugar. You're really buying 3/4 of a cup of sugar and a 1/4 cup flour, and that is why they were concerned about chametz. The Ashkenazim who were concerned about using sugar on Pesach, they had one solution. If you boil your sugar before Pesach, then it's okay to use it on Pesach. So you have to think to yourself, boiled flour is better for Pesach than not boiled flour? To the contrary, the flour is fine until you boil it. Once you boil it, now it becomes chametz. But what were they trying to do? They would get this dough that would boil to the top, they would skim it off, and they would keep the sugar water as their sugar for Pesach, which then should tell you that if you're able to remove flour from sugar by boiling it and just skimming it off the top and using that liquid, then all the things that you know about chametz not being allowed to come in contact with food, and that's why we have to be so careful by food production. In that case, the halachot are clearly, they don't match up to what people used to do. But I'm not in a Pesach class. Right now I'm in the class of Halav Yisrael. So Meir explains that we're concerned, one, with mixing milk into there, and also we're concerned of the tzchtzukei chalav, the leftovers of milk that might be inside of the container or inside the utensil or maybe on the surface of a cheese or whatever else it might be. And the Meir mentions that these are other reasons why we might be concerned with the milk that a non-Jew milked. In source 5, Mori Harav Yaakov Peretz explains that there are really two questions. That the one question that surrounds two different stances that surround the question of whether milk that a non-Jew milked is kasher for us or not. And these are terms that we use in halakha. Is it something that is ne'esar b'minyan or lo ne'esar b'minyan? Meaning, are these things that are a blanket rabbinic prohibition, no matter whether we can check if the milk is kasher or not kasher, our rabbis prohibited any milk that a non-Jew milked and a Jew didn't see it, it's not able to be consumed? Or is this davar shelo ne'esar b'minyan? This is something that is not a blanket prohibition, and there are ways around it if you are able to check whether this milk is kasher or not. Davar shelo ne'esar b'minyan also would refer to really, is this a decree of our court? Or is this something that is Chachamim are telling you, look out for this, but if you look out for it, then it's fine. So this machaloket is a many-way machaloket. Rabbi Peretz writes in source 5, Ta'am isur chalav tameh v'tokpo. The reason for non-kasher chalav being prohibited, and its reason, haim ne'esar b'minyan, v'lachen afilu b'makom u'v'zman she'en behema teme'a metzuya lachlov mimena asur. If you live in a place that has no non-kosher animals, you live in an Arab country. They don't eat pigs. They don't milk camels. And we'll read about milking camels a little bit later, by the way. The milk that's in the market is only from cows and sheep and goats. Is the milk from goyim still prohibited? Meaning, is this a matter of kashrut, that I have to make sure my milk is kasher milk? Am I prohibiting this milk at a blanket level? It doesn't make a difference if you could prove to me this is cow's milk. So long as it came from a non-Jew, you can't drink it. Or is this something shelo ne'esar b'minyan, which is, if I could tell you there's no non-Jewish animals, no kosher animals around. The non-Jew milked the milk, but it came certainly from a cow. Would that milk be kasher or not? The opinion that this is able to be circumvented by ascertaining whether this milk is kasher or not is the opinion of the Rambam, the Rashba, the Smag, the Tshuvat HaGeonim, the Ramban, the Ritba, the Rivash, the Rashbatz, the Peri Chadash, the Peri Toar, and many, many other poskim. All of them understand that this prohibition against non-Jewish milk has ways around it. If you can ascertain that this milk is kasher, and we're going to mention different ways in which you can do that, then this milk is fine to consume. But there are other chachamim, v'yesh poskim shesovrim shechalav shel goy ne'esar b'minyan, that so long as the non-Jew milked the cow, it doesn't make a difference that you can prove to me now that it's cow's milk. You take it to a laboratory, or you tell me that all the animals in the world are kasher, or you tell me that it's more expensive to milk a camel than it is to milk a cow. It doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is the non-Jew touched the cow. That makes the milk not kasher. And I would argue that when we hear the term Halav Yisrael in the Jewish community today, that they're all coming from the second camp of rabbis, which is this milk is not allowed to be consumed no matter what you tell me. And those who consume milk that is not Halav Yisrael, and I'm saying that in a way that I'll explain later, that milk is really kasher milk. Yes, a non-Jew might have milked that milk, but for various reasons, which we'll discuss in today's shiur, that milk has been determined to be fit for consumption because it does not fall into the prohibition of chalav shechalavo goy ve'en Yisrael roehu, milk that was milked by a non-Jew, and a Jew did not see him milk it. And if you look explicitly in the Mishnah and Avodah Zarah, and then source 6, Chachamim tell us, Elu mutarin ba'achila. These foods are foods which are permissible for consumption. Chalav shechalavo goy, milk that a non-Jew milked, v'Yisrael roehu, and a Jewish person saw him milk the cow. So this is really the flip side of the other Mishnah that we read. Meaning, if I am standing there watching the non-Jew milk the cow, then that milk is permissible for consumption. I'm now allowed to eat that milk. Tosafot, in source 7, writes something fascinating. And he says, Tema, Deha Tani b'matnitin, we learn in the Mishnah, V'Yisrael roehu, that a Jew has to see the milking process. Mashma halochazele kol she'ata asur, that if the Jew wasn't supervising every single second of the milking, then the milk would be not kasher. V'yesh lomar, rather you should say, he says the Tosafot, Deroehu lav dafka. The Jew doesn't actually have to see the milking be done. Ela ratza lomar yachol liroto. All that needs to happen is that you could see the non-Jew milking the cow if you wanted to. Let's try to understand what's going on here. We are concerned with this milk being milked by a non-Jew because maybe they're going to mix not kasher milk into our milk. And they're going to go milk a pig instead of a cow. So the most ideal way to figure that out is to watch, maybe you should milk the cow, but you don't own a farm. So you have to go to the dairy farm to buy yourself milk. So what do? You look at the non-Jew while he's milking to make sure he's milking a cow and he brings it to me. Tosafot says, you don't have to see the milking. You just have to be able to see the milking. We're going to discuss certain circumstances that might be like that in just a moment. The Mordechai says that Harav Peretz, who's one of the Rishonim, he writes that even if you could see that there's no not kasher animals in his whole barn, it's just cows, you still have to watch him because maybe he mixed some non-kasher milk there before he started milking the cow. And so that leads me to want to see, what does the Rambam say? When we look at this halachot, what does the Rambam write? So the Rambam says in source, page 3, Chalav be'emat teme'ah, non-kasher milk. Notice he doesn't say Chalav Yisrael or non-Chalav Yisrael. Milk that comes from a non-kasher animal. Eno nikpa v'omed k'chalev teora. It doesn't become cheese like kasher milk does. And therefore, if they're mixed together and you put rennet inside, says the Rambam, the two will separate from each other. Because of this, Yiten Hadin, the law says, Shekol chalav hanimtza biyad goy, that all milk that is now owned by a non-Jew, asur, is forbidden. Shema erav bo chalav behema teme'ah, because maybe they mixed inside of it non-kasher milk. Ugvinat hagoyim, and the cheese of non-Jews, which is next week's class, muteret, is permissible. She'en chalav behema teme'ah mitgaben, because we know that non-kasher milk cannot turn into cheese. And so because of that, if it's cheese, you know that the ingredients here are kasher. But in the times of the Mishnah, our Chachamim prohibited us from eating non-Jewish cheese, and we will talk all about this next week. I don't want to get into this now. In the left column, Yud Gimel, Hauchel Givinat HaGoyim, Somebody who eats cheese of goyim, or chalav shechalavuhu, ve'en Yisrael roehu, or milk that was milked. No, he doesn't say chalav Yisrael, or chalav, what do they call it now? Chalav stam, what is it? Chalav stam, they call it, yeah? He doesn't say that, the Rambam. A Jewish person who drinks milk that a non-Jew milked, but a Jew didn't see it happen, makin oto makat mardut. We beat him in the bedin. Says the Rambam in Halakha Tedvav, Yisrael sheyashav betzad ha'eder shel hagoy. If the Jewish person is sitting on the side of the herd of the non-Jew, vehalach hagoy vehevilu chalav min ha'eder, and the non-Jew went and he brought him milk from these animals. Afal pi sheyesh ba'eder behemat teme'ah, even though there are non-kasher animals in his herd, harei ze mutar, it is permissible. Ve'afal pi shelo ra'ah oto cholev, even though you didn't see him milk, meaning he goes into his barn to milk the animal. You're sitting in the waiting room. There's a lobby in this organic dairy farm, cage-free, pasture, grazing, grass-fed cows. You're sitting there in the waiting room. You brought your bucket to get it milked, and he says, listen, sit here in the air conditioning. I'm going into the mud with my boots, and I'll get you some milk. Now you see there are pigs over there, says the Ramban. You see he has camels and alpacas, maybe some llamas also. But says the Rambam, as long as you were sitting outside there, even though he brings you the bucket, you didn't see him milk the animal, the milk is kasher. Why? Because as long as you could stand up and see him milking if you wanted to, the non-Jew is afraid to go get you pig's milk, because he knows you might stand up and see him, and then he'll be busted, he'll get in trouble, and because of that, he's afraid to milk a non-kasher animal. Says the Rambam, that's reason enough for the milk to be kasher. So let me explain. The Mishnah says, milk that was milked by a non-Jew, and a Jew did not see it being milked, this milk is forbidden for consumption. When you are sitting outside of the flock, you cannot see the milk being milked. Correct? So how does the Rambam tell you, harei ze mutar? It's permissible to drink the milk. Here it's even worse. There are non-kasher animals there. Maybe you should be afraid he'll milk the non-kasher animals. Says the Rambam, no. So long as you could stand up if you wanted to. This is what the Tosafot were saying. So long as you could stand up if you wanted to, the non-Jew is afraid, mityareh. He's mityareh that you will see him mislead you. And because of that, says the Rambam, as long as you are able, if you wanted to, you don't have to see him. That is considered as if you saw him, and this milk is kasher. That's exactly what leads us to understand that for the Rambam, this is not a prohibition against milk that was milked by non-Jews. This is not a matter of Chalav Yisrael versus Chalav Goyim. It has nothing to do with the Jew or the non-Jew exactly, but it has everything to do with Chalav Teme'ah and Chalav Tehorah. Is the milk kasher or the milk is not kasher? Says the Ramban, so long as there's reason to know that he's afraid of you, because you might see him, you don't have to see him, as long as you might be able to see him, this milk is kasher. But the Rambam adds, and I think Rabbi Yitzchak Berdugo, who sent me the source in the morning, made the connection for me. I never wanted to make this connection because it was slightly off topic. But once Rabbi Yitzchak told me to make this connection, I accepted the truth from him. And so I quickly added it to the source sheet, and about 10 minutes before the class, I told Ohad, please take the source sheet and send out a new one. I need a new one here. So this is the bottom of page 3. If you don't see anything in the bottom of page 3, you're likely using the old source sheet. So if you go to the shiviti.org/Habura, you will see the new source sheet posted over there. In the 17th chapter of the Laws of Forbidden Foods, the Rambam writes, why did they prohibit the vinegar, for example, of goyim? Because they put inside of it things that come from wine. Says the Rambam, Hamurias. I don't want to deal with what is murias right now. But they normally put vinegar, wine inside of this murias. Asur, it's forbidden. But if the wine is more expensive than this murias, then it's permissible to drink that murias. Why? Anytime Chachamim tell you you should be careful because maybe the goyim put inside of this food something that is not kasher. For example, they always tell you, you can't just buy something without a hechsher. It has vinegar in it. Yes? Tell me, what is the prohibition of drinking vinegar? What is halachically prohibited about apple cider vinegar? How about white vinegar that comes from potatoes? Or white vinegar that comes from corn? Or white vinegar that comes from grains? What is forbidden exactly about rice vinegar? There's nothing forbidden about those things. So what? There's balsamic vinegar, which comes from wine. There's white wine vinegar, red wine vinegar. Have you ever tried to buy white vinegar versus buying balsamic vinegar? I don't know how it is over there where you are, but where I live, a little container of balsamic vinegar that's kasher will cost you an arm and a leg. I'm not exact, maybe $10, $20. The gallons of white vinegar, white vinegar is so cheap. People wash I don't know why you would want your house to smell like vinegar. People clean things with vinegar. It's so cheap. These gallons of vinegar can cost you $4 or $5. Why on earth would someone choose to use superior quality vinegar for you and not tell you about it? And so here the Rambam says, any time where we're afraid the goyim might mix something not kasher into our kasher food, she'en adam me'arev hayakar bezol, you should know a rule. Nobody ever tricks you by giving you something more expensive for less money. Shaharei mafsid, because he's going to lose. It's a business lesson for the Rambam. Aval me'arev hazol bayakar. But people always trick you by mixing cheap things into expensive things. Kedei listakar, in order to become wealthier, meaning to make money. So here you have to understand. The Rambam is telling you, every time Chachamim tell us that the goyim might mix something into your food, you just have to ask yourself the question, what I'm afraid of them mixing into my food, is it cheaper or more expensive than that which I'm buying? And though Rambam doesn't mention this in the context of the laws of milk, but he tells you this is a general rule every time we're concerned. And why does the Rambam say we're concerned of milk that was milked by non-Jews? Because we're afraid they might mix non-kosher milk into it. And therefore this applies exactly to the case of the Rambam. So now according to the Rambam, there are two ways to determine whether your milk is kasher, aside from watching it being milked. One, if you are able to watch it be milked if you wanted to. You don't have to, but if you would be able to stand up and see. Why? Because mityareh, he's afraid of you. In cases where the non-Jew is afraid to cheat you, then you don't have to be concerned about the milk. The second case, says the Rambam, is any time the milk mixing into your milk is more expensive than the milk that you're buying, then you don't have to be concerned. So I'll tell you. I read an article not so long ago in Costco. We have in the United States Costco. I think also in the UK there's Costco. They decided a while ago to get into the camel milk industry. They want to bring camel milk to Costco. And I haven't seen yet camel's milk in my Costco. I check out almost every time that I'm there. It's a few years ago, 3 years ago maybe, I read this article. And they were talking about how difficult it is to milk a camel. Aside from physically how to milk a camel, but the camel produces maybe 3 liters of milk a day. Whereas the cow produces 3 liters of milk every single time you milk it, every 10 minutes. The cow, especially today in the dairy industry, it's not so ethical. The cows are forced out milk. They pump out milk in ways that are not normal. But in any case, your dairy cow can give you vats and vats and vats of milk. And camel's milk is very expensive. So the average price of a bottle of camel's milk will be 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times more expensive than your jug of cow's milk. And therefore, think about it this way. Why on earth would a non-Jew sell me higher priced milk for the $2 that I pay for kasher milk? What do they get out of it? And because there's no logical reason for them to mix that milk in my milk, then there's nothing to worry about. But I should stop the class here. We answered the question. We need to know the rabbis made a rule. The rule that a rabbis made is that milk that was milked by a non-Jew and a Jew didn't see him milk it, it's not kasher. But if a Jew saw him milk it, it's fine. And the Rambam says even if he didn't see him, but he could see him, it's fine. And the Rambam says that even if he didn't see him, but there's no reason to assume, you know for sure that the non-kasher milk is more expensive than the kasher milk, then all of your milk is fine. There is no blanket rabbinic gezerah here. There's no rule. This is just a matter of practicality. Be concerned with milk that comes from goyim, because maybe they'll give you non-kasher milk. But in all these cases where you know that the milk is kasher, there's nothing to be concerned about. And the truth is, that's the emet. This is the halakha. There's nothing more to say here. But I know how this topic has snowballed and it's become such a big deal in so many Jewish communities that I would be remiss if I didn't read these sources to you that are in the rest of the packet. And so with your permission, I want to look at page 4. I once had a rabbi who visited me. I can tell you, it's okay. He's a Chabad rabbi. Now, I have a lot of respect for Chabad. I'm not a Chabadnik, but I appreciate, things that Chabad do for Am Yisrael. And my rule is that if you want to criticize somebody, at least you should do what they do, and then you can criticize them. But they do a tremendous amount for Kehillat Yisrael around the world. Though I don't always agree with the means or the methods, but they don't answer up to me, so it doesn't matter. This rabbi heard me give a shiur about Halav Yisrael, and he came to me with a Shulchan Aruch. Says, "You don't know how to read Shulchan Aruch," he tells me. "Black on white, according to your book, you have to keep Halav Yisrael." And I sat with him, and I tried to explain to him, and it didn't work. And I tried to explain to him, and it didn't work. I tried to explain to him again, and it didn't work. At a certain point, I told him, "Rabbi so-and-so, let me tell you how this works." And I'm sorry for the comparison. When a Christian missionary comes to me and tells me, "This is what Isaiah 53 means," what I tell the Christian missionary is, how about you leave my books to me? Don't tell me what my books mean. I won't tell you what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John mean. Don't tell me what Yeshayahu said. I'm not going to tell you what Matthew said. I said, when it comes to you and me, I'm not going to tell you what the Tanya really means, and you please don't tell me what the Shulchan Aruch really means. This is my rabbi. He's my rabbi's rabbi. He's my rabbi's rabbi's rabbi. We learned from him exactly how to read the Shulchan Aruch, and it's okay that you discovered the Shulchan Aruch, and now you want to make sure, hey, this is exactly, fine, good, wonderful. In your interpretation of Shulchan Aruch, you could read whatever you want. But I'm not interpreting Shulchan Aruch. I'm reading the Shulchan Aruch. It was taught to us by all the Sephardim around the world as students of the Shulchan Aruch. So, like I said, just like I won't tell you exactly what the first Lubavitcher Rebbe means and Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah about the emanation of God, of course. So then you shouldn't please come to me and preach to me about what the Shulchan Aruch means. And on that note, let us read the Shulchan Aruch together. There's one halakha that is relevant for this week, and two halachot that we will leave for next week because they have to do with the topic of cheese. Chalav shechalavo goy, milk that was milked by a non-Jew. So Maran is copying and pasting here. Ve'en Yisrael roehu, and a Jew didn't see him milk it, asur. Shema erev bo chalav tameh, because maybe he mixed into it non-kasher milk. Haya cholev beveto, v'Yisrael yoshem mibachutz. If the non-Jew was milking in his house, what do you mean in his house? They said somebody once met a farmer. And he says to the farmer, what are you going to do? There's a snowstorm tonight. How are you going to leave all your animals outside? He says, don't worry, I bring my donkey inside so he stays warm with us by the fire. He says, and what's the donkey going to do? What are you guys going to do with the smell? He says, don't worry, the donkey will get used to the smell. So he was milking, not in his house really, in his barn, whatever it was, wherever he keeps his animals. And the Jew is sitting outside of the barn, so he does not see the milking. If he knows there's no non-kasher animals in that barn, it's permissible to drink that milk. Even though the Jew cannot see the animal being milked when it's being milked. If there was a non-kasher animal in his barn, so this guy raises not just cows and goats and sheep, but pigs and camels and alpacas. And the Jew is sitting outside. And the non-Jew is milking for the Jew. Even if you can't see him, you're sitting down, you can't see the guy. If when you stand up you could see him, then it would be mutar. Even though you didn't stand up. As long as you could stand up. Shiare, because he's afraid, Shema yamod virehu. He's afraid maybe you'll stand up and see him. V'hu shiodea shechalav tameh asur l'Yisrael. This is Maran, something interesting. The non-Jew has to know that you're not allowed to have pig's milk or camel's milk, that you're only allowed to drink kasher milk. So usually, in situations of kashrut, we prefer the opposite. We have something called maslat. Masiach lefi tumo. I want him not to know what I need. Because if he knows what I need, he'll tell me what I want. Here is the opposite. I need him to know that I can't drink milk from a pig. So make sure it's only cow's milk. And even if you can't see him, but so long as there's potential to see him, this milk is kasher. What's the significance of these writings of Maran? The significance is that Maran agrees with all of the rabbis that this is a davar shelo ne'esar b'minyan. This is not a blanket rule. You remember by the cooked foods of Goyim, we said, we're not allowed to eat their food because we might come to marry their children. We said, what about somebody who doesn't have children, like a Catholic priest? Our rabbis don't make a difference. This is a rule. A gezerah is a gezerah. There's no way to get around the gezerah. If that was the case by milk, then it doesn't make a difference. You can see him, you can't see him, you tested the milk, it's more expensive, it's less expensive. None of that would matter. Because there's a rule from our rabbis that you cannot drink this milk. But the moment that our Chachamim tell us there are ways, if you could stand up, even if you didn't see him, then that means that milk that was milked by a non-Jew, and a Jew didn't see him, it's not kasher. Milk that was milked by a non-Jew, and a Jew saw him, the milk is kasher. We're adding now a next sentence. Milk that was milked by a non-Jew, and a Jew didn't see him, but he could have seen him if he wanted to. That milk is kasher. This now tells us that this decree of Chachamim is not a decree. They're letting us know that this is something we have to be concerned with. The Ramban writes in the Grey, and ideally, צריך להיות הישראל בתחילת החליבה ויראה בכלי שלא יהיה בכלי שחולבים בו דבר טמא. We have to make sure that he's there and looks into the bucket first to make sure there's no non-kasher milk in the bucket. Okay, it's a chumrah of the Ramban. ונהגו להחמיר שלא יחלוב בכלי שדרכו של גוי אלא חלוב בו שמא נשארו בו צחצוחי חלב של גויים. We have to be careful to make sure that maybe we bring our own bucket. Let's not use his bucket because maybe there's some residue of the milk that he milks from his non-kasher animals in that bucket. Says the Ramban, מיהו בדיעבד אין החוש לכל זה. At the end of the day, though, if they already milk the milk, you don't have to worry about not the machinery, not the cups, not the bowls, not the buckets, nothing. It doesn't actually matter in the halakha. These are only ideal things. But when you come to purchase something in the grocery store, is that the chatechila or b'diavad? Now there's an article coming out in the Habura's newest book that's coming. I wrote in there, the things that you buy in the store, it's not the chatechila, it's b'diavad. It already happened. They already milked the animal. You didn't check the bucket. So this is exactly the case where Ramban says, you didn't check the bucket, maybe there was non-kasher milk, it's fine. Ushfachot. What about our maidservants? Shecholvot ha-behemot bevet Yisrael u'badir shalahem. That they milk the animals in the Jewish property. Kol makom she'en bet goyim mafsik ve'en nachush דבר טמא מותר אפילו חתחילה להניח אותו לחלוב אף על פי שאין שם ישראל כלל דמאחר שהוא בבית ישראל או בשכונתו אין נחוש דבר טמא. Says so long as your non-Jewish employees are milking it in your property, and you know that you only have kasher animals in your property, and there's nothing blocking your vision between them, you and the rest of your property, meaning there's not a non-Jewish neighborhood in between your barn and your house, it's on your property. Even though you don't see your employees milking for you, it's okay. They're not Jewish, but they're allowed to milk for you because they're afraid, and because you know there's no non-kosher animals there. But if there's a non-Jewish house in between, the Ramban says you have to make sure you could see them. ואפילו ישראל קטן או קטנה מועילים, דאגוי מרטט לפניהם. Says you can even send your little daughter or son, a child, with the non-Jew to watch the milking, so long as they're afraid, the non-Jew is afraid, this milk is mutar. Ramban is telling you it doesn't have to be vision, you don't have to be able to see them, it could even be your child. I mean, anything that causes the non-Jew to be afraid of making a mistake, of mixing kasher milk with non-kasher milk, is enough to make this milk permissible for consumption. But this should now start in your mind, if you remember reading, that in places where there's government supervision and the non-Jews are afraid, this is where these ideas are coming from. We're going to get there, but these are where these ideas are born. Okay, the next paragraph is too long. Let's skip it. Turn with me to page 6. The Taz, Turei Zahav writes, on the words of Maran, which says that as long as you could stand up and see him, the milk is fine, says the Taz, Nira de kol sheken de mehanek shu yotzev nichnas. It's even works, meaning for sure that it works, if you enter and exit the barn. Meaning, you're not sitting out there the whole time, you're on your phone. You're wandering around in a place, but you keep coming and checking every once in a while, periodically, to see the milking. that's also fine, because he's afraid you might come to see him, even though you're not, meaning you don't have to sit outside of that barn literally. But as long as you go in and out, to spot check, that's fine. The Shach, in source 2, he says the same thing, the Ta'amahu, the reason, Mishum de Miratet, because he's afraid. דהו הדין אפילו אינו יושב תמיד אלא יוצא ונכנס ויושב שערי וכל שכן יוצא ונכנס למקום החלב. As long as you're entering in and out, either the side of the barn or even into the barn, all of those things make this milk permissible. In source 3, you find that the Tashbats, in the end of the Shalot V'Shavot of the Tashbats, there was a book added there called Chut HaMishulash. This Chut HaMishulash seems to have been written by 3 major Chachamim of the Sfaradim. And they write the following. V'chen mori v'Rabbi HaChasid, my master and teacher in the Chasids. This is an early work of Sephardic Halacha. Kvod Morenu Harav Yosef ibn Nabi. Shayu kol hanegotav al pi Rambam. My rabbi, he says, the Chut HaMishulash. My rabbi, who everything that he did was according to the Rambam Zal. Haya shoteh hachalav shechalvo goyim. He drank milk that the goyim milked. Afal pi she'en Yisrael roehu, even though a Jew didn't see the non-Jew milking, בארצנו זאת ואמר לנו שהוא ז"ל עושה כן על דעת הרמב"ם ז"ל. So that he does this based off of the Rambam in our country. כן כתב ז"ל וכזה מורין בכל דבר שחוששים לו, because there's no reason to assume that they're going to mix the non-kasher milk with the kasher milk. וכפי זה, and due to this, בארצנו זאת, in our country, שחלב הגמלים הוא ביוקר מחלב בהמה טהורה, that camel's milk is more expensive than cow's milk, and חוששים לתערובת, we don't concern ourselves that maybe they'll mix a superior milk and our inferior milk, ולזה היה הוא ז"ל שותהו, and that's why my rabbi, who everything he did according to the Rambam, drank this milk. I want to show you these sources, because most people know that we drink milk that is not Halav Yisrael because of some heter of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, alav shalom. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, he decided. Now, the flip side of that is, I'm going to show you on the last page of this packet, that there's some kind of retraction of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. And they, see, even you who are following Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, you are wrong. And I'll tell you, when I say, Zot HaTorah Shosam, when I say, Torat Moshe Natan Lanu, I say these sentences of Moshe, I refer to Moshe Rabbeinu, alav shalom. No disrespect to Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. But whether Rabbi Moshe Feinstein said or he retracted, my whole Torah is not dependent on the writings of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, alav shalom. And so it's crucial for me to show you that we don't need those teshuvot of later day rabbis to permit this milk, and that already in the generations after the Rambam, those who consider themselves to be his spiritual students were drinking milk from Goyim. In source 4, the Rashbash. Rashbash is a special Sephardic Chacham. There's a special Tuda for Giyul that we use in my Betadin for certain Jews who have to do a Giyul Chumah. The Nosach was written for us by the Rashbash. They asked the Rashbash a question. In the areas that are near us, we go and drink milk from these Goyim who don't have non-kasher animals. Are we allowed to do that? The Rashbash says yes. And a long answer. He says yes. Because this, like we heard earlier, if there's no non-kasher animals, there's no reason to assume that they're going to put non-kasher milk. All of these things are fine. In source 5, Rav Chaim ben Atar. Who's Rabbi Chaim ben Atar? He wrote a book on halakha called Pri Toar. And he wrote many books. But his fame is very good. He's the rabbi of the Orach Chaim HaKadosh, of Rabbi Chaim ben Atar. He is the Orach Chaim HaKadosh. He is the rabbi of the Chidah, Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azulai. Yes? So you're talking here, the circles of Sephardic Kabbalists now. You're not dealing with students necessarily of the Rambam, if I have to speak kindly. Yes, these are Mekubalim. Rabbi Chaim ben Atar writes, Bimkomenu, in our countries, Nirad deshari liknot chalav migoy. It seems permissible to buy milk from a non-Jew. Shelo ra'ahu Yisrael, that a Jew didn't see him milk the animal, v'lo imad b'tzad edro, and he's not standing next to his herd. V'hagam sheyesh lo davar tameh be'edro. And this is true, even if we know that there's non-kasher milk animals in his farm. Because the non-kasher milk is more expensive and it's sold usually to upper class society, the kings, the princes, aristocracy. For sure they're not putting the more expensive milk in our cheap milk. But he says something interesting. But if a non-Jew gifts you milk from his farm, it's forbidden. Because every person who gives someone a gift wants to appease the one they're giving the gift to. And he likely would choose the more important of the milks to give you. So here you have to worry that maybe it's a gift, they want to give you a nicer milk. But if you're just buying the milk, there's no reason they would sell you camel's milk for the price of cow's milk. That happened to me once. When I was living in the old city in HaShamayim, I used to go to a certain grocery, Arab grocery, a few Arab groceries I used to go to. Why? Because the Jews, listen, everybody rips you off. The question is how much they're going to rip you off. L'tzarenu, I didn't have the money to pay the Jewish tax, to buy by the Jews. An example, a water bottle by the Arabs could cost you 4 or 5 shekels. In a Jewish store, 11 or 12 shekels. If it's cold in the refrigerator, 14 or 15 shekels. 5 shekels. I simply don't have the need to lose that much money. So I used to go to this place, and this Arabic man, he had chalva. They would make chalva, from sesame seeds. And he made good chalva. And I liked his chalva. And I would always ask, what's in the chalva? Tell me. Fine, we need his chalva. One time he said, yeah, Rabbi, I have a special chalva just for you. It's a true story I'm telling you now. I said, what's so special about this chalva? This chalva, it can cure cancer. I said, chalva, it can cure cancer? Unbelievable. This is something, you should sell me the rights to this chalva, not just the chalva itself. I said, how does this chalva cure cancer? This chalva has camel's milk inside of it. Its healing qualities are known to going on and on about the camel's milk. Now it could be he believes all these things about camel's milk. And the truth is that I'm glad he told me, because the chalva is not kasher. Now, you see that he considered it something special for me. And likely, if this guy was going to give me a gift, I'd have to be careful, because the gift he might give me would be from the more superior chalva and not from the cheaper chalva. This requires a person to have a brain. And this is something that is very difficult to ask from people, to use their brains. And especially in a world where we're taught not to use our brains. And so you have to know in every situation, not to rely on labels and symbols, to know how to ask the right questions. I was once in a place. I have stories to tell you. So, later. Source 6. Harav Peretz writes, based on this Pritoa, לפי דבריו, based on what he said, הוא הדין בחלב של החברות של ארצות הברית ואירופה וכאלה. The same would apply to the companies that make milk in the United States and in Europe and other such countries. Meaning in civilized countries. I can't tell you, you're now traveling through a third world country, you're backpacking through, I don't know what the rules are over there, but you're in a normal civilized country with the Federal Department of Agriculture, they check on things, and there's rule, there's law, there's order. In those countries, like America and Europe, you are allowed to buy the non-supervised milk, because they're under very strict government supervision. That these milks are completely permissible. And he mentions a Pri Chadash. Look at the Pri Chadash in source 7. Rabbi Chizkiah de Silva. For those of you who are in my Shiviti UK class on Tuesdays, this Chacham has a very unique history. We talked about him in the context of Shabtai Tzvi. He writes the same thing as the Pritoa, that in a case where we're not concerned of the non-Jews mixing it, this milk would be fine. Yitzchak, you raising your hand?
Thank you. I know the logic and it makes sense, but we do have an example. For instance, in Europe, there was an issue where horse meat was being sold as just cow meat throughout the EU, and there were regulations involved, assuming that horse meat wouldn't be circulated into department stores, but they were found all across the EU. So I'm curious, how much can we really? We have cases where the big issues come about when the processes aren't being followed properly.
Okay.
If you know what I mean.
Let me answer quickly now, and if not, at the end of the class, I'll elaborate on this more. Fraud is rampant everywhere. just because fraud exists doesn't mean that fraud is the rule. And the way you understand whether fraud is good or bad, how you understand it, look at the way they persecuted the people. I'm not familiar with that situation, but likely when they caught these people, look what they did to them. It wasn't just like, okay, don't do it again next time. The idea here is that it creates fear. Whether or not, listen, most people who break the law don't get caught. I would argue that a person jaywalks or they speed on the highway, they don't get caught. But why are they afraid to speed on the highway? Because maybe they'll get caught. And so for that reason, most people don't speed. Some people do. But this is enough of a reason for us. It's not that we're relying on the government. It's not that. The government is creating a fear that we're relying on. And we're going to discuss this soon in some of the more contemporary sources. And Robert, is the question for now or for the end?
Thank you, Rabbi.
Of course.
Well, in a way, I was going to answer the question by saying if you watch the negative publicity that happened to that supermarket as a result of that, there was tremendous negative publicity, and the consequences of the supermarket were massive. So actually, I think it proves the point that when they were caught, they got themselves in such trouble that it's a deterrent for other supermarkets to end up in the same thing. I mean, I don't think they did it on purpose. I think there was some negligence.
That's my answer. That's exactly correct. Let's look at the Chida. So we mentioned the Pri-Torah. Let's look at the student, the Chida. The Chida writes from the Pri Chadash, what we already saw in the first paragraph, and he quotes the Rav Bet David and a few others that they really didn't like this, and they said some pretty miserable things about the Pri Chadash. The Chida has a hard time with how they were able to speak that way about them, and he says that this is really the custom of Algeria. And then on the top of page 8, he mentioned that there was a famous debate between the Pri Chadash and the Maharash Ailon. Alyon, I don't know how to pronounce his name properly. He's a rabbi from London, was a rabbi in London. I don't know if you've heard of him before. Rabbi Shmuel Alyon. He was a rabbi of a Spanish community of mostly people who fled the Inquisition and came to London. And it's interesting that his fight with the Pri Chadash was, how dare you be so lenient about milk? Because really the Maharash spent most of his life being persecuted as a supporter of Shabtai Tzvi. And so, though he was adamant that you had to be very particular about milk and that you could not rely on this false leniency of the Pri Chadash, it's very fascinating that at the same time he had certain, or I'm not saying he had, I don't know him, I can't chazron, I can't speak, but he was accused by other chachamim of his generation to have Sabbathian tendencies. Now, it's true, the Bedin in London did make him, his opponents apologize, and they were excommunicated until they retracted their statements about his messianic activities. But it's a very unique generation. There's a book from Rabbi Moshe Chagiz. Rabbi Moshe Chagiz was the son of the famous Rabbi Yaakov Chagiz. Now, he wrote a few polemics against the Sabbathians. One of them is called Shever Posh'im, something like that it's called. And that entire book is to fight these specific Chachamim who were accused of being Sabbathians in this generation. Which leads me to wonder, tongue-in-cheek, if there is some type of connection between those who are very particular about milk and those who have all kinds of messianic tendencies. I don't know if that's the connection, but Hamevin Yavin. And the Chida just questions whether or not this story could have ever happened, because he's not sure that the Pri Chadash and the Maharash were ever in the same place at the same time. Maybe it happened through correspondence, or maybe the entire story is fabricated and it's not true. And that leads me to page 9 of my source sheet, because I really wish to deal with certain realities that existed in at least Sephardic countries that we're familiar with. A few sources, it's not exhaustive. There are definitely thousands of more sources I could have collected, but I wanted to pick from the places that were in front of me. Rabbi Rafael Aharon ben Shimon, by far one of my favorite Sephardic Chachamim in the world, wrote a book called Nahal Mitzrayim. If you're familiar with Rabbi Shem Tov Gagin, they passed by each other. Rabbi Shem Tov Gagin was a rabbi in Egypt at a certain point, if I recall correctly, and in the Bet Adin, after Rabbi Rafael Aharon ben Shimon, I have a shiur about him also in my UK playlist somewhere. And he writes, as the chief rabbi in Egypt, Rabbi Rafael Aharon ben Shimon was a special chacham. There was an Ashkenazi community in Egypt, and he needed to make sure that they would have representation in the Bet Adin. And so he made an Ashkenazi Bet Adin and brought an Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Egypt. You have to understand, this is unheard of. His name was Rabbi Aharon Mendel HaKohen. And he would sign himself chief Ashkenazi rabbi of Egypt. And at a certain point, the Ashkenazim, who liked to fight with their Chachamim, they made his life miserable, ended up firing him and replaced him with some fancy-looking, educated doctor who pretended to be a rabbi on the side. And Rabbi Yonatan Halevy was so sad that his friend, the Ashkenazi chief rabbi, who's much younger than him, was out of a job, that he brought him to sit as the third rabbi in his Bet Adin. And so almost every Sephardic proclamation you're going to find coming out of Egypt in the Bet Adin of Rabbi Yonatan Halevy has at the bottom also signed, and I sign Rabbi Aharon Mendel HaKohen. You wonder how Rabbi Aharon Mendel lived in Egypt? It's because the Sephardim were willing to take him in when the Ashkenazim threw him out. A very special personality. So he writes, "B'Mitzrayim, in Egypt, Tilot le'el Yitbarach," in source 1 on page 9. "Ha'inyan hu metukan me'elav b'dei Shamayim." Hashem has solved the problem of milk that was milked by non-Jews. "Shagoyim mochei halav enan cholvim et ha'behemot bebetam limkor et halav bashuk." The non-Jews don't milk the milk in their property and then sell it on the market. "Rak mesavavim im behemotehem bekar v'tzon." They travel through the streets with their herd. "U'ma'amidim ha'behemot b'fitchei ha'chatzerot." And they stand in front of your courtyard. He says, in some countries they deliver milk to your home. Here, they actually deliver the cow to your home. You bring out your bucket, they milk it for you into your bucket, and they keep walking to your next door neighbor. Why have to package and deliver? You can just deliver the cow, and that's what they used to do. He said, and Baruch Hashem, that's what solved the problem. He mentions in Bet that in Mitzrayim, that's not relevant to me now. Look in Zayin on the left side of page 9. Chalav shechalavo hakarai. This is a fascinating halakha. In Egypt, there were two main streets, of the Jews and of the Karaites, who were also Jews. I have a shiur in my UK playlist about Karaim. It's very important to understand who the Karaim are. They're part of Am Yisrael. Yes, we may believe that they're mistaken in their understanding of the Torah, but biologically they are Jewish. Now, can we trust their kashrut or not? If a Karaite, milks the cow, can we drink that milk? He says, Im hakarai yishteh ma'chalavahu mutar gam ledidan. If the Karaite will drink the milk, we'll drink it also. Deha inhu na mikpid al chalab b'matimah, because they also keep kasher in terms of milk. Ven chashash l'tar ovet. And so we're not concerned. If he'll drink from it, meaning it's not just something he does for business, but if the Karaite will drink from that milk, we can drink from it also. In source 2, Rabbi Yonatan ben Shimon, as a curiosity, I added this source. It's not a halachic source, but he added as a curiosity that there's another reason why in Egypt you have to be careful not to drink milk from goyim that you didn't see be milked. Nothing to do with kashrut and everything to do with danger. He says that by the non-Jews, they had a situation by the Arabs in Egypt. He heard rumors that when they get sick, they soak themselves in a milk bath. And they let all of the sickness go out into the milk. And then when they're done with the milk bath, it's a very expensive bath. So what do? They gather all the milk in buckets, they bottle it, and they sell it for the cheapest price they can all around town. And he says it's very possible that they would sell you this milk because it's so cheap, and it would be dangerous just because it's come in contact with a diseased person, and that milk could be contaminated, and you could die from that. And that's why you shouldn't buy it. He writes at the end here, Homnam, but I don't accept that, I'm not the source of this information, so don't hold me to it if I'm wrong. I'm only sharing with you what I've heard. You can go to Egypt yourself, look for yourself. And if you want to be careful, it's a good rumor to be careful about, and make sure you research the source of your milk to see that it's not some kind of, COVID contaminated milk or something like that. You want to make sure that this milk is able to be consumed for health reasons as well. In Morocco and Algeria, the famous Chacham, Rabbi Yehuda Ayash. Rabbi Yehuda Ayash wrote a number of books. The book I'm quoting for is the Bet Yehuda. If you've ever met Algerian Jews, ad etzem hayom hazeh, every ruling of Rabbi Yehuda Ayash is standard law by the Algerians. He came to Algeria and he standardized the ketubot, and he standardized the gitin, and he standardized the entire Bet Adin. He was a force that you could not reckon with. Fascinating works of halakha and minhagim. And in there he writes that in our places, the custom is that we buy milk from goyim. Everybody does that. There's no reason to be concerned, just like the Rashbash wrote. And he mentions that in the winter, we're careful not to drink their dairy beverages because they make this milk beverage that they boil in their pots, and their pots are not kasher, and because of that we don't drink it. But don't think that that means we don't drink their milk. It just means we don't drink the milk that they boiled in their non-kasher pots. Rabbi Yosef Masas has 3 different places that I found in which he talks about Halav Yisrael. It could be there are other places, but these are the sources that are in front of me. I'd like to read to you at least the first teshuvah, just so you get a flavor of the sharpness of Rabbi Yosef Masas. He writes, Tam ha'isuhu mishum chashash chalav behema temeah. Everyone's concerned with non-kasher milk. That's the reason. Kach pasag Rambam, Kakatavatur, Ubet Yosef, Shulchan Aruch. All the Chachamim say the reason we don't drink the milk is not because there's some supernatural phenomenon that Jew needs to touch the cow. That's what makes the milk kasher. It all has to do with, is the milk kasher or is the milk not kasher? So Halav Yisrael or Halav Goyim is a misnomer. It has nothing to do with the Jew or the non-Jew. Is it Halav kasher or Halav tameh? That's what we need to know. Vimken, and therefore, in a place where you don't find non-kasher milk, you don't have to prohibit it. By the way, I'm going to tell you something now. Think about all the grocery stores you shop in, not just the Jewish ones. I want you to make for me tonight soup. Cream of mushroom soup with pig's milk. Or with camel's milk. I'll settle for camel's milk too. Llama milk also I'll be okay with. I just want to know which grocery store in your neighborhood you're going to go to buy that milk. You live in a reality where there is no non-kasher milk. It does not exist. I'm not even sure that in a specialty store you could buy this milk, but even if it could, in the groceries where you go, there's no such thing. You live in the reality of non-kasher milk does not exist. We don't have camels in North Africa. Only the desert Arabs, they have camels. The camel's milk is extra expensive. Kifle kiflaim. I made a typo when I typed this up. It should say kifle, not kifche. Kifle kiflaim. Al chalab be'emat Torah. Kasher mesaprim aravim mesachim tumam. The Arabs tell us when they're just chatting with us how expensive camel's milk is. וחלב חמורות וסוסות, גם הוא אינו מצוי העיד לכלל אפילו רפואה, כאשר שומעים מערבים מסתר. We also hear the Arabs chatter, meaning not intentionally. They tell us that there's no such thing as donkey and horse milk around here. כי אומרים שהחלבם הוא מועט, והם יחלבו יזיקו ולדותיהם. Because the Arabs believe, first off, they know that these animals are not so efficient at producing milk, and they're afraid that by milking them, they'll harm their babies. גם יש להם ניחוש של חלבם. They have some kind of superstition not to milk these animals. כי אומרים שהחולב אותם יקרו לו מקרים רעים. They believe in a superstition that if they milk these animals, bad things will happen to them. גם אומרים שחלב חמורות וסוסות הוא ירוק וניכר לכושר של בהמה טהורה. And like the Chachamim of the Gemara, he says you could tell the color of non-kasher milk is more green than that of the cow's milk. ואומרים עוד, and they say שאם יתערב ממנו בחלב בהמה טהורה אפילו מעט, ניכרת ערובתו על ידי חוטים ירוקים שלו. He's quoting the Gemara that you can tell even if you mix it, there's like strings, green strings. גם אומרים שהערבים אף המזוהמים שבהם מואסים אותו ותערובתו מפני ריחו וטעמו. That even the lowest of the population of non-Jews, they don't like this milk. It doesn't taste good, it doesn't smell good. ומכל אלו הטעמים יתירוהו הראשונים. זכותי מגן עולם. And that's why all of our early rabbis permitted milk of goyim. He says, ועתה נוסף עוד טעמה אחרינה. So we add another reason, שהממשלה מקפדת הרבה אף על תערובת מים בחלב. That the government is very particular even not to mix water with the milk, let alone milk with the milk. And therefore there's no reason to וכן, וזה מה שיש להשיב לכבודו בעזרת אנוהנו זה קיווינו לו ויושענו ברמנו אמן. Says Rabbi Yosef, that's all I have to answer you. There's no reason to be particular here. In source 5, he writes, מכתב כבודו הגיעני במועדו. I received your letter. וראיתי שאסף איש טהור, and I saw that you, a holy man, you gathered כל סברות המחמירין חומרות גסות. All of the people who collected the worst of the stringencies together. You're trying to make this milk not kasher. Know, my son, that all of those ideas that you brought in your book, that we cannot drink milk of goyim, and more than those, we know all of those reasons. Don't tell me how to learn. I know all of the things that you're saying. We've been doing this forever. And then he writes that maybe I should respond to your letter, and he says in bold, so I don't have enough time in my life to spend wasting on idle matters like Halav Yisrael. I just don't have time for it. There's no reason for anyone to deal with this. And then in 6, he writes the same thing. And that brings me to Yemen. Now Yemen, as you know, is quite a conservative place in terms of halakha. I didn't scour all of the writings of the Yemenite rabbis. I went instead to a contemporary Yemenite rabbi. I'm not from his Bet HaMidrash, and he's not from the regular Yemenite Rambam Bet HaMidrash either. His name is Rabbi Yitzchak Ratzabi. Do with him what you want, but he's recording here Yemenite customs and what he knows from Yemen. And he writes in source 7 that if in the city there is no non-kasher milk, dat harbe poskim, the opinion of many poskim, shemutar לקחת חלב מן הגוי אף על פי שלא ראה ישראל את החליבה, וכן הוא מנהגנו. We can buy that milk, and that is the custom. And then he says here that that's also true regarding the milk companies of our generation. But what's special here is not this. Look at source 8. He says, "Omnam yesh ktsat anashenam yodim sheminhagenu latir zot." There are some who don't know that we permit this milk. They think that Yemenites don't drink milk from goyim because my grandfather didn't drink milk from the goyim, and my great-grandfather didn't drink milk from the goyim. He says that's true. Your grandparents in Yemen didn't refrain from drinking non-Jewish milk because of halakha. Because in Yemenite culture, we simply don't drink dairy. It's not a thing. People don't pour themselves glasses of milk and drink them. By the way, when in Israel there was a depression in the early years of the state of Israel, and it was very common for Sephardic families to sell their dairy, like the milk they would get in rations from the government. They would sell them to Ashkenazi families and get instead meat or potatoes or rice because they didn't know what to do with so much milk. Cereal and milk, oatmeal with milk, coffee with milk. All of this milk consumption is not a very Sephardic thing, at least not from the Middle East. And it's interesting, by the way. We are the only adult animals in the world which consume dairy. It's something interesting to think about. And whether that's the right thing or not is another thing to think about. Maybe that's why the cashews and the almonds are busy nursing us instead. There's no proof, therefore, he says, that you can't, that the Yemenites didn't drink milk from goyim. It's not because of halakha, but rather it's because of the fact they didn't drink milk. Said I felt, even by the Talmidei Chachamim in Yemen, they permitted it. I asked, he said, and even in the city of Tzana, which was where all the Torah was happening, we never heard anybody open their mouth and chirp against his minhag, aside from some very small individuals who kept it to themselves, because that was not what was accepted in Yemen. Chacham Mordechai Eliyahu, Alav Shalom, is one of my favorite Sephardic Chachamim in terms of his personality and his teachings and his stories. But when it comes to halakha, he comes from a very different camp. I'm going to say it like that. And Chacham Mordechai Eliyahu quotes, there's a famous teshuvah b'Chalav. I don't know why I didn't quote here the volume number for you. I can, if you need the volume number, send it to me and I'll give it to you. In source 9, he quotes the Khatam Sofer. Listen to how this works, because it's an Ashkenazi logic here. The Khatam Sofer says that milk that was milked by a non-Jew is prohibited because of a minhag. The minhag is that all of the Ashkenazim accepted it upon themselves as a minhag. And because of that, it's already almost an isur deoraita. It's almost a biblical prohibition. And because it's almost a biblical prohibition, nobody in the world can undo a biblical prohibition. So very quickly, here's how this logic works. A rabbinic, not a law, but a rabbinic requirement to check that the milk is kasher became an Ashkenazi custom. And because it became an Ashkenazi custom, it's now a biblical law. How does that logic work? That's all of Orthodox Judaism. That's how it always works. Something was written, and the Ashkenazi community, they decided this is the only opinion in the world, and now we have to treat it like an Isur Deoraita. But with all due respect, I have a hard time buying this. But you see in source 10, that the Aruch HaShulchan, who's usually lenient in many areas of halakha, is adamant that it is forbidden to rely on, he calls him Eze Acharon, some rabbi. The Pri Torah, the Pri Chadash, you're calling some rabbi. Then he says some pretty miserable things I don't want to read to you, about how the people will be punished for drinking milk that is not Halav Yisrael. There's a book in source 11, I only saw him quoted elsewhere. There's a few Me'il Shemuels. Likely, this is the Me'il Shemuel was an Ashkenazi rabbi. I think his last name was Rabbi Yudilovich or something like that. He lived in Yerushalayim. He says even b'di'avad the milk is not good. But then you come to the Chazon Ish and Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. And both of them, everyone knows Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. I think very few people know that the Chazon Ish, who is usually very stringent in areas of halakha, unreasonably stringent, he also agrees that yesh makom lomar dehavi kishfachot acholvot demirtatot, that in our situation where the government has supervision over milk, that it's like those maidservants that the Ramban mentioned that are milking the cows for us and they're afraid. That's why you can drink that milk. Moshe Feinstein also says that, and he says, and look at the bottom of what Rabbi Moshe Feinstein writes in source 13. And therefore, anyone who wants to be lenient, yesh lo ta'am gadol, he has a very big, compelling reason to be lenient in this matter. U'rashayin, he's permitted. U'chumoshe mikilin b'zeh harov b'nei adam shomrei Torah. And that's why most observant Jews are lenient about this. V'gam harbe rabbanim, and many rabbis, v'chas v'shalom lomar, and God forbid you should say, she'osin shelo kadin, that they are in violation of halakha. Aval mikom makom, nonetheless, this is always the baalei nefesh. If you want, one day, go to Sefaria and put in this term baalei nefesh, and see all the places where this term baalei nefesh, people who care about their soul, meaning scrupulous individuals. Min haraui lachmir, they should be strict. Ve'en bezeh mishum yuhara, and it's not considered prohibited to be strict because you're showing off. It's not showing off. V'cher kach ani noheg, and that's my custom, says Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. Lachmir latzmi, I'm strict to myself. Aval mi sherotzeh lakel, and anybody who wants to be lenient, hu oseh kedina. He's following the halakha. Ve'en hachshivo kemezalzel b'isurin, and you cannot consider him a person who is lenient in forbidden matters. So Moshe Feinstein says it's okay. There's a lot to rely on. Even big rabbis do this. But if you want to be careful. But on account, don't be careful and treat other people who are lenient as if they're doing something wrong. My wife, her sister, is married to the family of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. And in the family, from what I heard, I'm not a source, but from what I heard, that Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, he kept Halav Yisrael, and his wife didn't. It was really something he did as an individual for himself. Now, if you look on page 18, and you'll read this after class, I won't have time to go through with you today, I quoted an article. The article was titled, New Letter from Rav Moshe Feinstein Zatzal at Cholav Yisrael Appears. Now this here is a new letter. Someone died, and they found this letter in his desk, and it's a saying Rav Moshe Feinstein really that really you shouldn't rely on my heter, only if you really need to. Okay, and that's why I told you earlier in this class. It doesn't shake me if Rabbi Moshe Feinstein retracted, even if he fully said I was wrong. It wouldn't shake me, because I'm the Ramban, the Rashbash, the Tashbetz, the Chut HaMeshulash, the Pri Toar, the Pri Chadat. What do I need? Also this. If we keep going, on source 14, Rav Mordechai Yaakov Breish, I don't know how to say his name, he was the rabbi of Zurich. He told a story that he saw that there was some lady, she was a maid in someone's home, and she would bring the milk from a very far distance, and someone asked her, how do you make the milk that it doesn't spoil? She says, I take the milk, and every few hours I milk some of my donkey into the bucket, and it keeps my milk fresh. She says, though I don't want to learn the halakha from a non-Jewish maid, but it's very important to take that into consideration when ruling halakha. You can do with that information what you wish. And there are many anecdotal stories. And I grew up hearing all kinds of stories. There was a place in New York, and they found out that they put pig fat on top of the milk to keep it cold. Even if it's true, it's not true. But even if it was true, so what? It doesn't change the way we learn a halakha. But anecdotes seem to make people very excited. I only have about 10 more minutes, and I wanted to dedicate the end of my shiur to one last section here. The extra reading you'll do on your own. And this is where people become very worried. I've seen that it comes Pesach, all of a sudden we keep Halav Yisrael. 10 days of Teshuvah, Halav Yisrael. Certain times in their life, they're very afraid to follow the halakha here. And it seems to me that this has been because of some fear that by drinking milk or consuming dairy that is not Halav Yisrael, which already said that term is not a real term. It's either kasher or not kasher. And if it's not kasher, even we can't drink it. And if it is kasher, then everybody can drink it. But they're afraid that it's going to damage their soul, it's going to hurt their heart, it's going to make their connection with HaKadosh Baruch Hu disappear. This is something that's peddled very aggressively by certain Jewish communities. And as I said before, as much as I respect Chabad and the work that they do, Halav Yisrael is one of their 11 commandments. This is one of those things that they teach and they speak about, and not for nothing. Their Rebbes believed very much that the milk that you consume directly influences your neshama. And so because of that, though all the Hasidim are scrupulous about this, but because likely in the Jewish community, the most Hasidim we interact with are likely from the Chabad community, no matter where you live, it's important to know what they say and why they say it, and why we are not concerned even on a Kabbalistic level. Now, maybe you're not concerned on a Kabbalistic level at all, and that's also fine. But if you were concerned on a Kabbalistic level, I'm here to assuage your fears and tell you, you don't have to be concerned, even on a Kabbalistic level. Let's look. Sources 1 and 2 are from the 6th and 7th Lubavitcher Rebbe's, respectfully. And the 6th Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, came over to New York. His son-in-law, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, alav hashalom, followed. As you know, there was much politics, whether the seventh Rebbe should have been the Rebbe or not have been the Rebbe, and that led to all kinds of interesting history in Chabad. One day when we're not on camera and you want to learn about some things about Chabad and Lubavitch that you didn't know, we can do it off camera, but on camera, I'm going to stick to the topic. Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson writes in Yiddish, so I got to translate it into Hebrew. Thank you to a Chabad article. There's a famous story. That once somebody came with his son-in-law, Lamdan Gadol, who was a very big Torah scholar, Rabbi Liozna. He came to Liozna, where the first Lubavitch Rebbe, the author of the Tanya, was. And he complained that his son-in-law, who was always acting in the path of holiness, he started having crises of faith. He started bringing up questions that people didn't have. They say that whenever you learn Torah, I'm sure that someone's heard this in the Habura before. Don't bring up these questions because people didn't used to have these questions, and now you made these questions. It's an interesting mentality to have. So he started having questions about his emunah. And even my son-in-law, he's in pain because of the doubts of emunah that he has. You know, by the Hasidim, doubt is like the enemy of everything. You can't question anything. Everything needs to be clear and full of faith. Amar lo Harabi, the first Lubavitch Rebbe said, Shehu, that he, the son-in-law, nichshal belo yodim bechalav goyim. It must be that he unintentionally consumed milk from goyim. V'natan lo tikun, and he gave him a tikkun, how to fix this. V'hu hivri beruchaniyut, and his spirituality became healthy all over again. So here you have a man who's a Torah scholar, who's asking questions in emunah. And the questions of emunah are not prompted, God forbid, by his learning of Torah, and therefore there are questions that come up. But his questions in Torah are prompted by some unknown thing which is causing him tzar. And the first Lubavitch Rebbe, the Alta Rebbe of Chabad, he knows exactly why. Because he must have inadvertently consumed milk that was milked by a non-Jew, and that's why, and as long as, now he'll do a tikkun, take my prescription. He did a tikkun, and all of his sifikot went away. Now, he's fine. Now for you, that might seem like a Hasidic story. But if you're a Hasid, this is a big deal. In source 2, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the last one, was asked about a young Avrech, and he says, Hine ma she'amarti lo benogea lechalav goyim hu, that which I told him about the milk of non-Jews, al pi sipur hayadua mikvod kedushat mori chami admor, based on the story from my father-in-law, that's source 1. Shechalav goyim, that the milk of non-Jews, me'orer sefekot be'emunah, they awaken inside of you doubts in your faith in God. Velu advarim she'amarti lo, that's what I told him. V'she'im bechol hazmanim haya tzarich lizaher ma'anal, kamuvan u'pashut, and if in all the generations you had to stay away from non-Jewish milk, because it's always dangerous to have doubts in Hashem. Alachat kama v'chama, how much more so, hanoar d'artzot habrit, the young American youth, u'ifrat be'elu halomdim b'mosdot shesham ta'arov tov v'ra u'lo milo mi'ematz, and especially those who learn in public schools, God forbid. You have to make sure that they drink only kasher milk, because they're even more vulnerable to sifikot in emunah, and you don't want to exacerbate the situation because of the milk which they drink. Nobody promised you something rational. We promised you, though, that this is what the Hasidim are concerned of. You could tell me it's okay in halakha, and you can tell me that the Pri Torah and the Pri Chadash and the Ramban, you can tell everything you want. But it doesn't matter. You want me to have doubts in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You want my children to not believe in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I would never do that. I would pay 10 times the price of milk to buy Halav Yisrael milk. And so perhaps I could pause here and take you through where exactly does this idea of timtum halev, of dulling of the heart or disconnection with the Kadosh Baruch Hu as it relates to kasher food come from? The earlier sources that I found for this is the Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, and this should not surprise you. The Ramban tells us in the bold, Lehodia, this teaches you, she'im yibadel adam min ha'ma'achalot hara'im, that if a person stays away from the bad foods, meaning those that are not kasher, he's talking about Parashat Tazriah, Havayin lo banim hagunim kedoshim u'tohorim, your children will come out to be holy and pure and good. V'im lav, but if you indulge in non-kasher food, harei negaim mitchadshim alehem mitzad tipat hazera shayta me'otan ma'achalot ha'asurot ha'meshukatzot. That, I'm not going to translate literally, that baby that came from you and your wife, that was sustained by the non-kasher food that you ate, will come out to be a bad child with all kinds of terrible things because they were nurtured from non-kasher food. This and I will tell you that the blood that is born into your child comes from the food that you eat. And the sperm of a man, the child of a man, comes from the food that he eats. Therefore, your child is directly influenced by the food that you eat. And then if you eat non-kasher food, the children that will come out, Hashem Yishmor, will happen to them. Now, this is fine. The Ramban is explaining something according to Kabbalah. This is the way he sees it. And this idea that what you do affects the spirituality of your future generations is why the Ramban is trying to tell you, don't eat food that is not kasher. Okay? So far, he's not talking about milk. He's about food that's not kasher. Rabbi Yaakov Chaim Sofer, the Kav HaChaim, in source 4, on page 13. He quotes from Shaar Gilgulim. Shaar Gilgulim was written by Rabbi Chaim Vital, student of the Arizal. And he says, "Valken yesh chasidim nizharim lelech achar divrei hamachmir." The reason why the pious people are so careful to always be strict in halakha, never to be lenient, afal gav delefum dinahu mutar, even though according to halakha it's permissible. Because when the spirits go up, they're very particular with righteous people. And every person in heaven, they're more particular with them based on how great they are. נפשו לעשות חומות וחסידות ביותר. וכושר אין נשמתו מתוקן כל כך, תאווה נפשו דרך הקולות. Says the Kav HaChaim, something amazing, based on Lurianic Kabbalah, and that is that if you see somebody who always liked leniencies in halakha, I don't know where to hide, I'm going to hide. His neshama must come from a very inferior place, a very low place. But someone whose neshama comes from a very lofty place, and they're always striving towards chumrot. Now you understand, but I answered for you everything there. This is the reason. I have a book. I have it here. I got it in my library. Truth is, I don't even remember how I got it in my library. I don't know who wrote it. I never met him. He's a contemporary rabbi who's still alive in Israel. I take no responsibility for anything else he said, aside from this piece here. He wrote a book called Patbag HaMelech, which is on the laws of non-kosher, bread and foods and milk that were from Goyim. And he writes something fascinating in the introduction. This introduction has a haskama, by the way, from Rabbi Yosef. Halav Shalom. And he sticks his head here in this Kabbalistic conversation, and he says the following. And as the Rambam taught us, Kabel et ha'emet mi she'amaro. Accept the truth from whoever says it, even if you don't know who he is. The Ben Ish Chai complained that the Ashkenazi rabbis were very careful only to learn early sources, classic sources. And they neglected not just the contemporaries of their generation, they neglected any acharonim. They didn't care. And he said the Sephardim, because they were humble, he calls it humility, they learned not only from the acharonim, but they learned even from rabbis that were contemporaries of theirs to make sure that they were accurate, and they brought all of the opinions in halakha. And so hopefully I'm giving the Ben Ish Chai some nachat here. He writes in source 5, I will end with this source today. V'im shani afar, even though I am dust, v'eni chidai klal uchlal, and I'm not fitting here worthy at all. V'yadati afisut erki mamash, and I know how lowly that I am. Mikol makom emet agid v'lo ekached, I will not hold back, I'll tell you the truth. Shalafi aniyut dati, that in my opinion, all of these words, divrehem nechonim rak b'dvarim she'asurim min hadin. That the Ramban, the Kav HaChaim, they're talking about things that are actually, what causes bad spirituality? Things that are really prohibited. Things that are forbidden. Kegon behemot temeot, non-kasher animals, and so on. אבל בדברים שנחלקו בהם הפוסקים. But areas in halakha which the poskim argue, ומרן ז"ל התירם, and Maran says they're fine. או שלפי כללי ההוראה הם מותרים באכילה. Or in other ways they're permissible. There are other reasons to permit them. הדבר ברור, it's simple, שאין החשיבם כמאכלות אסורות כלל ועיקר. That those foods are, when we drink milk that is now mutar, it's not a violation of halakha, it's mutar in halakha. The Ramban wouldn't say that makes you have some type of suffering in your soul. הדבר ברור שאין מקום להחשיבו כאיסור ממש. Anything which our rabbis permitted for us through the rules of halakha cannot be considered something which would have a negative effect on us. וכן מדויק מלשון הרמב"ן שהבאתי ברש ממיר שהאדם צריך להיבדל מן המאכלות הרעים. And that's why the Ramban is very particular when he says the bad foods. וודאי דברים שמותרים מן הדין. And certainly things that are permissible according to halakha, hagam shesh b'machaloket b'poskim, even though there's an argument among the poskim, page 14, enam kirui machalot harayim, the Ramban wouldn't call them evil foods. Dehavi kemotzi la'azan matirim. How dare you tell other chachamim that the food that they're eating are rayim? So one, it doesn't apply. The Ramban, the Or Chaim HaKadosh, Kavachayim, all of those who talk about these spiritual consequences, that's about not kasher food, according to the Kabbalists. But food that is kasher, according to the rules of halakha, they would never tell you that because you're relying on the Shulchan Aruch, you're ruling like the Rambam, that food is going to make you have some spiritual consequence. And he says one more thing. Ve'ilu min hagam sheYisrael haya b'torat chumah bilvad, v'aynu midat chasidut. Says, and if the Jewish people were keeping Halav Israel out of chasidut, piety, extra levels of stringency, hecharashi, I would be quiet. Aval ma nasa, what will we do? She'enenu haraot, our eyes see in this generation, shehem nuhagim kach min hadin hagamur, that they think that this is the absolute halakha. V'af harabanim morim ken, even the rabbis tell people this is the halakha. V'af mefarsamim piskei halakha shonim v'al pi rov hem osrim kol davar. And the rabbis of our generation like to put out halachic books, and everything is prohibited. You don't have to read the book. Just know everything is prohibited. Nothing is allowed. That's the style of the chachamim of our generation. Especially the things that you see that people think are not allowed. If you look in the actual halakha, the source, says the Patbag HaMelech, most of the time when you see Jewish people not eating something, not doing something, when you dig into the origins, you should see that it's permissible. Then either the reason why they're stringent is because they don't know how to learn halakha, one, or because they're too afraid to make a halachic decision. Harav Peretz once told me that most of the chachamim we're familiar with are too afraid to rule in halachot. So because of that, they're always being strict. But that's not considered being strict. And that's the conversation for a different shiur. I wrote about it in my book. And then he says here, he mentions here about Rabbi Ovadia Yosef that his style is to always be lenient, and because of that, he was making the Chachamim happy, and so on and so forth. You can read that already on your own. But I wish to summarize my shiur right now. And that is that the milk that Chachamim prohibited is not the milk that we have in our stores. One, because the milk we know is kasher, because we have supervision of a government, because there's no reason financially that they would mix it for us, because there is no non-kasher milk floating around, so on and so on and so forth. All of this is mutar. Mutarim lachem, mutarim lachem, mutarim lachem. But I'll add one more thing. 3 years ago, I went to visit, no, not even 3 years ago, 2 years ago, right before COVID, in January of that year, I was in Israel. Then I sat with Mori Harav Yaakov Peretz, my wife was with me. And I hadn't seen Harav Peretz in a year. I sat down and said, Harav, ma chidush yesh bebeit midrash. I'm quoting Rabbi Eliezer ben Hurkanus. If you're familiar with that story, I have Rambam shiurim, maybe 69, 70, 71. They talk about that story. What's new learned at the Beit Midrash today? Rabbi, I haven't seen you in a year. I want to hear a new halakha from you. Harav Peretz smiled at me and he said, Tov, Rabbi Yonatan, ma agid lecha? What can I tell you, Rabbi Yonatan? He said, you don't have to keep Halav Yisrael. So I sat there and I told Harav, thank you. I don't keep Halav Yisrael. He says, good. I said, no, but Harav, I asked you for a chidush. Already, it's been 10 years or 11 years. I already learned this halakha from you. So what's new? What's new today? He said, what's new? That's a good question, he said. He said, Rabbi Yonatan, let me tell you what's new. He said, what's new is that I always told people they can drink milk from goyim. Always. He said, but I used to say, if somebody was strict about it, then in HaShamayim they would reward them after 120 years. If they, after 120 years, HaKadosh Baruch Hu would help them out. He says, now the conclusion that I've reached is after 120 years, they're going to get no extra points in Shamayim. Not only that, they might even give them din v'cheshbon that they wasted their children's money or their wives' money or their husband's money buying things they don't need to buy. He says, that's the chidush on the Beit Midrash today. And with that, I summarized my entire shiur, and I think there's nothing left to say. There's nothing more that I can add to that story. And Bezrat Hashem, HaKadosh Baruch Hu should guide us on the path of truth. The things that we bring into us are all tehurim and mutarim, and we don't have to be afraid to follow the rules of halakha as they were given to us by Moshe Rabbeinu and Har Sinai, and understood by our chachamim until the chachamim of our generation as well. Bezrat Hashem. Thank you so much for learning with me today, and God willing, I look to see you next week.